This shouldn't exist. The world's biggest train station, built on a mountain, not beside it, not below it, on it. Where millions of passengers travel today, there was once no room for tracks, no room for platforms, yet China decided to build here. Before the first platform could be built, before construction could even begin, engineers had to reshape the mountain itself. And that's where this story begins. The decision had been made. The world's biggest train station would be built here. But when construction began, there was a problem. No building site. Not even space for a construction site. Just rock. Steep slopes. And a mountain. So the engineers did something unusual. They didn't build the station first. They built the place where the station could exist. Excavators cut into the rock. Bulldozers reshaped the slopes. Day after day, more of the mountain disappeared. Thousands of tons of material were moved. Where there had once been nothing but rock, new flat surfaces appeared. Space for cranes, space for concrete, space for a train station. Slowly, the mountain the engineers had found began to disappear. And now, here wasn't a single platform, because the biggest challenge was still hidden below the surface. And it would have to support millions of tons. The mountain was ready, but that didn't mean it could support the station. Millions of tons of weight. Day after day, year after year. Everything would depend on what was being built now. So the engineers began deep below the surface, meter by meter. Thousands of tons of concrete were poured. Steel disappeared into the ground, because everything that would rise above would rest on these foundations. But weight wasn't the only problem. Rain, temperature changes, movement inside the rock. The mountain was always moving, had to account for forces that would continue long after construction ended. Nothing could be assumed. Everything had to be tested. Survey teams mapped the terrain. Engineers analyzed the rock. Specialized equipment drilled deep below the surface to understand exactly what was hidden underground. Because if the ground failed, nothing above it would survive. Months passed, and from the outside, almost nothing seemed to happen. There was still no station, no roof, no platforms, no passengers. Only machinery, concrete, steel, and preparation. But slowly, things began to change. Retaining walls appeared. Support structures spread across the site. The ground became stronger, more stable. Then, things began to change. Between the foundations, the first columns appeared. Then more, and more. For the first time, it became clear where the platforms would be, where the halls would stand. The foundations were no longer supporting just concrete and steel. They were supporting the first parts of the station. And now, the real assembly could begin. The foundations were finished. But there was still no station, no platforms, no halls, no roof. Nothing passengers would ever recognize. Everything still had to be built. And some of the largest components weighed hundreds of tons. They had to arrive in sections, then lifted high above the construction site. One mistake could have cost months of work, day after day. Massive columns rose from the foundations. Steel stretched across open spaces. Platforms began to take shape. Then came the largest components. Entire sections suspended in midair, guided slowly into position, because every component had to fit perfectly. And somehow it did. Soon its scale became difficult to comprehend. Construction crews worked on multiple levels at once. Cranes moved in every direction. New sections appeared almost daily. Then came one of the biggest challenges: the roof. Massive steel structures were lifted above the entire site. For a few moments, they hung over the mountain. Then, they were connected. Suddenly, the project looked different. Not like a construction site, like a train station. A massive one. For the first time, the vision was real. And now, only one question remained. Would it work? After years of work, the station was nearly complete. Glass, lighting, technology, miles of cable. Everything was finally coming together. And now the project was about to be tested. The construction site slowly disappeared. Cranes were removed. Temporary roads vanished. Barriers came down. For the first time, the finish line was in sight. But the engineers weren't done yet. Every critical system had to be tested. Power, communications, safety systems. Everything had to work together. Because once the station opened, millions of people would depend on it. Then came the final phase: testing. Trains entered the station. Signals were checked. Systems were monitored. Engineers watched every movement, looking for anything that had been missed. Years of construction came down to a handful of critical moments. Slowly, it rolled into the new station. Across ground that had once been solid rock, past platforms that hadn't existed just a few years earlier. The systems worked. The tracks worked. The station worked. What had once seemed impossible had become reality. The world's biggest train station, built on a mountain. A few years ago, this was just a mountain. Today, it is home to the world's biggest train station. Millions of people will pass through this place. And most of them will never think about the fact that this once seemed impossible. A mountain reshaped, reinforced, rebuilt. Not because it was easy, because it was necessary. Perhaps that's what makes projects like this so remarkable. Not that they once seemed impossible, but that once they're finished, they simply become part of everyday life.